All right, well, welcome to the Medicine and Health Professions Launch Community Panel. We're really excited to have everyone here. We are thrilled with our panel. I cannot tell you enough about how meaningful I found every single panel. I think this is our 10th one and we have 8 more to go this term. The learning, the depth at which the conversations have gone, the questions, the interactions, the grappling with the issues we're facing right now based on particular career interests and identity affinity interests have been really moving and exciting. So thank you so much, Jessica, Brian, Victor, and Ugoma, if she's already here, for your willingness to do this. I know that this is the evening time and it eats into our personal time. So we're really appreciative of your availability. And of course, thank you, Dunstan, for pulling a lot of this together, and for the committee, the Launch Communities Panel Series Committee, who have done a lot of work to make this happen. My name is Daniel Pasco. I'm Associate Provost for Immersive Learning and Career Design. Have the privilege to be here with Dunstan, who is our launch catalyst, one of our 3 launch catalysts at the Launch Center. And what I'd like to do is to get started by talking just a little bit about launch, just to give context, not only about our work, but also where does this panel fit into the scope of what we're trying to do. So launch is a new approach to undergraduate education that we are implementing at Drew. You'll notice that there is a launch website called Launchpad that you can access at launch.drew.edu. And you'll notice that in the landing page, there is a very neat map that the Drew Office of Communications helped us develop based on the work that we're doing. Launch is a very powerful curriculum. It is a curriculum of our 1st and 2nd year students. And it has 3 goals. One is to help students identify a purpose at a moment when 87% of the world's workforce is struggling to find meaning in what they do. Second goal is to prepare students for their careers at a time when we're expecting 11.9 transitions in the journeys of our students as they graduate, and when we're going through a number of market and career shifts, as you can imagine, based on our current situation. And the third goal is the preparation for impact in the community and the world at a moment where we need to respond to our systemic challenges. It is operationalized through 7 high impact practices or key strategies. One of them is a course that every student takes in their 2nd term that has a curriculum that looks like this. It is connected to this e-portfolio called the Launch Plan that students curate and in which they keep records, in which they make track of their progress, where they get feedback, where they reflect, where they have learning artifacts and other pieces. They also prepare this as a presentation and present it before alums, faculty, staff, and peers as part of their curriculum. Get very valuable feedback there. So that's the course and the plan that they continue creating through the rest of their time at Drew. Another curricular portion of launch is the immersive experiences. Students are expected to do 2, all of which show in their transcript. They can do as many more as they want. And it can be any type of experience as long as it meets certain criteria that in our minds make an experience meaningful. And therefore it can be student employment, internships, micro-internships, research, student leadership, TREX, community-based learning. There's a diversity of experiences students can complete. So these are the 3 curricular components of launch. The 3 of them have a very intentional emphasis on the development of transferable skills and interaction with a network of mentors, right? So the 3 of them part of their criteria or their curriculum is to engage with mentors and to develop transferable skills. And then we scaffold that experience through career communities and identity communities. You can see here how we have a collection of career communities, including tonight's, which is medicine and health professions. And then we also have identity and affinity communities. So as an example of that, you can see that we have a page for medicine and health professions. This is a powerful way of us integrating systems. So we have integrated 7 systems, and we feed data from multiple systems so that in one same place, by career interest or by identity interest, students can access experiences like internships and jobs, blogs, mentors, events, success stories of alums and students. There's Anstenes, our community leader, featured internship and jobs, featured resources. We have industry sites. We have related student organizations, new courses, special electives, all curated for this particular career interest, and an opportunity to provide us with feedback, questions, or content recommendations. Of course, in addition to this page, we have programming for each community, like this panel. Part of Launch is we are in the middle of implementing what we call our 2020 Launch Expo, which has our Launch Community Panel Series, which we're experiencing right now, 18 panels. You can see them, here. We have 1 panel per community. And then also, we had a couple of weeks ago, here's the video, so you can watch our Immersive Experiences Fair to know what students are doing, what immersive experiences they are completing. It was a poster session, a very powerful event. And then on Friday, we have our Launch Communities Fair. We'll have a virtual booth per community where we'll have student leaders and faculty and staff and alums and some employers to share opportunities and experiences related to each of the communities. So you're welcome to join us. I strongly recommend, particularly students. You can then try as many communities as they interest you, whether career or identity, and explore connections, explore experiences, explore stories, and learn more about things. When you go to the community panel series, as you can see, there's 1 for each community. You can then click on the medicine and health professions, medical and health professions one, and that takes you to the page of today's panel, where we have our panels and a little more information about each one of them. So we have Ugoma and Jessica and Brian and Victor. You'll be more formally, you'll introduce yourself more formally in a minute. But thank you so much for your presence here today and for making these types of interactions and networking and story sharing available to students really at a moment where these types of interactions are very difficult, because Drew is completely virtual, because we're dealing with all these challenges that we have been facing in the last few months. So without further ado, let me stop there. I think I've talked enough. I'll pass the torch to Dunstanet, and Dunstanet, you can take it away. If you can put the program in the chat so that people can consume, what questions are going to be asked and have the links. One thing that I'd like to mention, students, is we've noticed that Zoom interactions have limitations, but they also have some areas of strength that otherwise we wouldn't have. They offer an augmented reality opportunity. So you can be browsing through the stories of the panelists. You can be browsing through the medical and health professions or medicine and health professions page. And in that way, have more context. You can also be looking at the program, and as you prepare your questions, you can see what questions are going to be asked, and then you can complement them rather than think of asking a question that at some point you realize is being asked as part of the panel. So thank you, everyone. Dunstanet, your turn.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel, for introducing Launch. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Launch Medicine and Health Professions panel. I'm so excited to have you all here, and I'm so excited to have our panelists who are going to introduce themselves in a couple of seconds. But first, I want to let everybody know that the The program should be in the chat. If for some reason you don't have it there, just like type it in and I'll share it again, but it should be there. I posted a couple minutes ago. So we're gonna get started by having our panelists introduce themselves. And so I'll call on you and you can talk a little bit about well, what you do now, your majors and minors at Drew, and some things that you want to highlight that led you to where you are now. So Jessica, if you don't mind, we'll start with you.
Sure, thanks. Good evening, everyone. So my name is Jessica Reyes, and I am a class of 99 graduate. I was a bio major, sociology minor. Currently, I hold a position. I am a senior director of clinical research at Timber Pharmaceutical, which is a pharmaceutical company that's focusing on rare dermatological diseases. I've been in the pharma industry for just under 20 years. Following Drew, I went and got my master's in public health at Boston University with a major in bioethics and health law. And I will say that my first year seminar at Drew was in sports ethics. And it was that compiled with my love for biology that kind of led me down this route of understanding more about biomedical ethics, about patient confidentiality and informed consent process as it relates to clinical research. And so my career essentially has always been in research and development within the pharma companies. I've done over 15 years of oncology research. And essentially my role was in authoring clinical trial protocols and in executing protocols. Those are the clinical studies that will in fact hopefully find their way into an FDA approved drug in a various indication. In pharma, you have an opportunity to work with many different disciplines. So biostatisticians, epidemiologists, many different disciplines that all make up the teams that are working towards looking at the science and getting the science out there to the public. Obviously, first of mind now is a lot of the COVID vaccine trials, which are obviously first and foremost in many of our minds. So I'm quite familiar with the processes that these trials have to go through in order to get to a place where they can be deemed safe and effective to be used in the general population. And I think that's probably a good enough introduction unless I missed something.
No, I think you covered it all. That's exciting. Thank you. So Victor, can you talk a little bit about what you're doing now, what you majored and minored in Drew, or minored in at Drew, and some significant things that happened along your path at Drew that led to you where you are?
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Victor Garcia. I'm currently assistant professor at New York Medical College. I'll explain a little bit of what that is later. But I'm a class of 2007 from Drew University. I majored in biology and Spanish, so I was double major. Heavily involved in science throughout my entire Drew career. And now, after that, I did my master's at the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, which is at now called Rutgers in Newark. After my master's, I did my PhD at New York Medical College, where I'm currently a professor. I left New York Medical College. There's a lot of stuff that happened, but while at New York Medical College, during my PhD, I discovered a receptor, which turned out to be a really big deal, and it's currently a really big deal. I left. I went to Yale to do a postdoctoral training, and then I was recruited back to New York Medical College to become a professor. So what does that mean? I have very little teaching responsibility. I do a lot of basic science research. So as I mentioned, I discovered a receptor, and we are looking at the receptor that I discovered. We knew its ligand beforehand, and now I discovered the receptor, and now we're trying to figure out what they're doing together in the context of hypertension, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity. Right now, it's really interesting what's going on in obesity. And I just do a lot of experiments all day, whether we're using human cells, cell lines, animal models. We work with a lot with mice. And I'm also involved, which is on the different side, with medical school admission and things like that. So if anybody had any questions about medical school and some of the things that we look for, you can ask me and I can help you with that. And that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. And Brian.
So my name's Brian Backinson. I am I'm an epidemiologist. I am an infectious disease epidemiologist for the New York State Department of Health. I've been here for just about, I don't know, 25 years or so. I graduated from Drew in 1990. And like everybody else, you have nothing goes perfectly the way you completely expect it to go. For me, while I was at Drew, I was a biology major. I was that kid who was always like turning over rocks in the woods and looking for stuff, under those. And I thought that would be like the thing that I would wind up doing, going and getting a PhD in entomology or something bugs like that. And eventually I realized that I had much more interest in trying to do things for broader community, right? To try and work with people, to try and make a difference. And in the course of doing that, public health wasn't really a thing that people taught back then. I think when I was at Drew, there was, I think, 8 or 9 schools of public health sort of around the country, and you rarely, if ever, got any public health education in an undergrad basis. So I heard the word epidemiology for the first time in a medical anthropology class at Drew, and it clicked. And I said, I want to go to grad school for this. And I wound up going to the University at Albany. Mainly because of not so much its reputation, but more so because of its link to the New York State Department of Health. I'm not from New York, but the thing that was really important to me at the time was the practical side of things, the actual feeling like you're making a difference, the working on real data that of people being sick on outbreaks and such at that particular point in time. And that's one of the things that differentiated Albany from other places, including much bigger name places. Went there, went through, got my master's degree, came to that fork in the road of, do I want to go on for more education? Should I be putting myself into debt? Things like that. And I chose to not. And I wound up working with some folks at the New York State Department of Health. Was slightly disenchanted with epidemiology. At least there wasn't enough biology in it for me. And then wound up going and working on Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases with a person who's turned out to be not just a mentor, but a really, really good friend. And eventually found my way back to epidemiology. Again, the link between bugs and people was something that was really interesting and really important to me. And when West Nile virus sort of came around, I wound up going back to the New York State Health Department in 2000, and have been there ever since. Since 2009, I've sort of have been there, the person who's been in charge of communicable disease investigation. And so it means I'm involved in pretty much any outbreak you can think of. The past 10 months have been miserable and exciting, sort of all at the same time. And my wife tells me I look exhausted constantly. So if I do, that I'll blame COVID for that. And I appreciate being here and not being on some other Zoom call right now, which is typically has been the way it's gone for the past 10 months or so. I also do teach infectious disease epidemiology. I'm an assistant professor at the Albany School of Public Health now as well. So I've taught infectious disease epi there since 2005.
Great, thank you. Thank you for choosing to be with us tonight, as opposed to, anywhere else. So yeah, I'm really excited to hear about, all of your backgrounds and to hear how you've sort of gotten to where you are. And so I wonder sort of what opportunities or challenges led you to your current jobs. So I know that some of you talked about like hearing about a concept or hearing about something in your classes at Drew that sort of sparked your desire to go on to what you're doing now, or at least to the first step, right? Because there doesn't seem to be a clear path. And so I'm hoping that all of you can like talk a little bit more about what sparked that interest. Victor, Dr. Garcia, we'll start with you.
So when I started at Drew, I actually wanted to go to medical school. And I was, I guess it was more like a family push than anything else for like medical school. And I didn't know anything about PhD programs, master's programs at the time. And it wasn't until I left and I did my master's. During that time, I was working for a pharmaceutical company named Hoffman LaRoche. And I realized while working at the pharmaceutical company that I really couldn't go forward or kind of excel or get a some sort of advancement in terms of position if I didn't have a PhD. And I wanted to do more like hands-on type of experiments and work. And then that led me to the PhD, right? And then when I started doing my PhD training, the biggest thing for me during my PhD training was having a good mentor, right? So I did have really good mentors at Drew. I had Tammy Winfelder, who's still there. She was really fantastic and kind of wrote all my letters for everything, really encouraged me to keep going and keep pushing school. And then when I joined New York Medical College, I found a great mentor, the current chair of the department, Dr. Schwartzman. And she was my mentor, and she kind of allowed me to grow as a scientist and gave me kind of all the tools. And then, there's a bigger backstory, which is when she was a postdoc there, she discovered a molecule named 20-heat, which is a lipid, right? That was in 1979, right? Since 1979 to 2013 almost, she was looking for a receptor, right? And it wasn't until I came along that somehow miraculously the stars aligned and I found this thing that became a huge deal. Now the entire department is working on. So yeah, that's kind of been my career path so far. And sprinkled in through education was a lot of just different job opportunities, whether it was with a pharmaceutical company or just working on my own, being an artist. I was an artist for some time, just on the side. I became this famous stencil graffiti artist for some time. In fact, Drew has still some of my work, like really around the campus.
Wonderful. Yeah, you touched on a lot of really things that I might want to touch back on, like, being open to different paths, mentorship, all of that. So Jessica.
Sure. So, so as I said before, I was a bio major, and I thought entering college, all I wanted to do was work in a lab. I wanted to be in a lab. I wanted to cure something. By junior year, I knew I would absolutely kill myself if I was going to be in a lab by myself all day. It just wasn't my personality. It just wasn't. But understanding the science was really fascinating, right? So how was I going to tie that to where my other interests were in terms of exposing some of what was happening from the medicine side of science and how it affects the public, right? So that's what led me to public health. And actually more focused in bioethics. So similar to Brian, there were a few more MPH programs at the time, but there were only 3 universities at the time that offered a major in bioethics. So Boston University was one of them. And I had a great mentor at BU. And when I was coming on to my second year and working on my thesis and so forth, I said, well, where do I go from here? And he's like, well, you can get your PhD and teach. And I went, okay, I don't know if that's really my calling either. And then so we started to explore other avenues, and BU had a similar type program to this, where they had a group of alum who were able to provide some insight as to some career opportunities coming out of public health. A lot of times People do great research in schools of public health, but sometimes the career opportunities seem a little bit daunting because you don't really know where you fit in. And so it just so happened that there was a small medical device company, ended up being back in New Jersey from where I grew up. Not only went to school at Drew, but I'm a Jersey girl through and through. So there's an alum from the master's program at BU, and she ended up interviewing me, and she said, I know who you know, I know what classes you took, I know what professors you learned from. I think this will be a great fit. And so that actually was the reason, I feel, that it was nepotism, that I landed my first position, which was a great entry level kind of position where I wore many different hats. I was introduced to regulatory affairs, which is, the idea of understanding all of the implications from the various worldwide agencies, such as the FDA and the EMEA and so forth, as to how you get drugs and devices through various phases of clinical trials, et cetera. I did clinical affairs, I did medical affairs, I did a little bit of all these different pharma terms and so forth. And it was through that opportunity that I started to learn a little bit more about really where my interests were. And that kind of launched my career in oncology. So I did work at Novartis right down the street from Drew for about 12 years in their oncology unit, which allowed me to use my bio background, right? Because I had to understand the mechanism of action of all these different compounds that were coming through. And I needed to understand the safety profiles when you're talking about how might this impact a patient coming into a trial who already has, say, hypertension, or already has some other underlying condition where we're now going to trial an experimental compound with them. So it was that coupled with how do we do this ethically? How do we treat the research participant, right? What are the components of the informed consent process that are so vital to them understanding I'm getting involved in a trial. This is what the risks are inherent to me. It might be double blind. I might be getting placebo. How does that affect my care? When will I find out if I was actually on the drug or the placebo? So that's really how those two areas married for me. So it's exciting because I do feel like I'm still helping people. I haven't cured anything yet specifically, but I was responsible for getting a drug that was only available in Europe and by prescription only in the US. Recently just became an over-the-counter medicine. It's called Voltaren. It's a cream, it's an analgesic. So it's topically treating when you get like a bruise that typically you might pop some NSAIDs for. So we're trying to get away from people constantly popping Advil, ibuprofen, et cetera. And if you can treat something topically as opposed to systemically, there's a huge, huge benefit for, for the body systems and so forth. So for me, it's a good marry, it's a good partnership in of the bio background and the ethics component.
Yeah, that's all wonderful. Yeah. And, again, you touch on things that we are going to touch on in a little bit too. I mean, you said nepotism, but really like networking, right? And having a strong network of people who can, guide you and give you advice or help you get jobs and internships and things like that, which is so important. So, Brian.
So I think I don't know that I'm going to talk too much about my time at Drew, but I'll talk about my time afterwards. So I think it's important to, I hate the term, but think outside the box. I think having a willingness to actually go off and do some different things and take some different classes and that type of stuff. You never know what it is that you're going to stumble into. I was a bio major as well. A medical anthropology class was not something that I had to take. It was something that I thought, this looks sort of interesting. So I took it, and that was where I found, this particular thing that sort of has become my field. That being said, it wasn't like magic right after that either. I mentioned earlier that I wound up going to the School of Public Health, where I went to do epidemiology. And I mentioned that I was a little disillusioned with epidemiology at the time. And some of that was because of how I went through things, right? In the beginning, I thought I wanted to do environmental epidemiology. or environmental health. And, I quickly learned that, when I was doing some work with radon, that was nowhere near what I wanted to do. And I wound up doing some stuff with birth defects and cancer at some point in time. Again, I learned this is not what I wanted to do. Sometimes it's really just as important to learn what you don't want to do as it is to learn what you do want to do. And I, again, working with, no offense to oncology and cancer, but if I had to, work with chronic diseases all day, I would probably put a bullet in my head. I mean, it's one of those things where I just, my personality is one where it is, maybe I have a short attention span. I don't know, but I love infectious diseases for the fact that I can deal with something and it can potentially get solved in a matter of, hours, days, weeks, sometimes during my lifetime, perhaps, whereas other things may not. When I was doing bench research on pathology of Lyme disease, for example, I was able to just, help with discovering a new pathogen. Again, really cool stuff. Made me interested in perhaps going into ecology and evolution, and was in that for a little bit of time and getting a PhD. But again, realized at that point in time, after being in it for a semester and a half, that it really wasn't for me. And again, I think it's sometimes as students, you feel like you're pushed to, you must know. I mean, if my sister is any indication what she does with her kids, there's this type of thing where, when you're 12, you have to know what it is you want to be when you grow up. And that's not really at least for me, that hasn't been the way that it works. And it's perfectly okay to go off and make some mistakes sort of along the way, or at least, like I said, learn what you don't like. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is if you're willing to kind of put yourself out there and go, say, even though I thought this is what I wanted to do, maybe it isn't. Maybe there's a slightly different angle that I want to wind up taking with this. Same thing goes for, when I was taking classes in Albany for that degree in epidemiology. One of the things that I routinely took classes that other people didn't, because I wanted to keep that biology, right? Instead of taking an epidemiology class that wouldn't interest me, I took a virology class, or I took a bacteriology class at the local medical school, which counted. But again, it gives you an opportunity to kind of manage and do things a little bit differently. Oftentimes what we run into, again, in my public health field, is people think that, epidemiology is one thing in one silo, and health policy is something that's in another silo, and bioethics, for example, is something that's in another silo. And in reality, in the real world, that's all pulled together. I work with environmental health on wastewater and COVID. I make policy on COVID. I do epidemiology with COVID, all of it every single day. And the world is really much more interconnected than oftentimes the way the academic world sort of makes you believe it may be. And it's important, I think, to think about that and one of the things that's good about Drew is sort of that broad-based sort of liberal education that I think that gives you a little bit of a taste of a lot of things. And even when you sort of, get out of Drew, I think they're knowing a little about a lot of things can be really, really important.
Yeah, thank you. And you really touched on an important part, a piece about being willing to try new things, being willing to learn what you don't like. And so, sort of thinking maybe a student who is interested in the health profession may not know which one, right? And so maybe like shadowing somebody, they learned, oh wow, I really don't like I don't want to be a vet, right? Or like, oh wow, I really do love public health, or I don't want to be an emergency room doctor, right? And so thinking about how having different experiences can really sort of help anybody narrow down what they want to do. Another thing you touched on, Brian, that I think is so important is the interconnectedness of so many health professions, right? Like, I think so many, like you mentioned, so often we think that we're all working in silos, and just when it comes to health, that just is not the truth, right? We all have to be talking to each other in order to have the best outcomes for people in the hospital, the public at large, even with like vets, and thinking about how like animals and insects, like you mentioned, interact with humans and how that affects our health, and then the environment. as well. And so I'm interested to hear, I know Brian just spoke a little bit about it, but I'm interested to hear from Victor and Jessica about how your work, how you work with different sectors, or different people in different fields. So Victor, yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so, I am a classically trained pharmacologist by was training in my PhD training. But right now, I integrate a huge amount of different techniques and expertise, and we're really in an integrated, what we call an integrated PhD program, which is you're in the Department of Pharmacology, but you have biochemists, cancer biologists, big variety of in terms of people with different backgrounds, huge amount of expertise, because everyone has that one little nugget that they can provide for your research and for your, you might have a question about something, or you might not be very well versed in some sort of technique, but somebody down the hall might, and that's really how I integrate a lot of different people and collaborate, and if your project becomes bigger and wider and broader, and just more people get interested in it, sometimes you might get a pharmaceutical company or two that comes asking for your help, and then you provide that expertise and kind of the insight that you might have. But yeah, I think it's, I try to integrate as much as I can, and usually you can do that with just training, right? Try to train, like when I left New York Medical College and I went to Yale, I did nothing that had to do with my project at New York Medical College. Right? It was completely brand new training. I had to learn from scratch everything, start a whole new project from the ground up, and that that really helps build that resilience, and that kind of it's a really good attribute to have, to be able to adapt. And you take core pieces and you develop them a little bit further, and you apply them for other things. So that's basically been my experience with that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And so this is something that we're going to talk about too, but what you just mentioned is like what we call transferable skills, right? And so the things that you have practiced from your time at Drew, probably throughout your graduate programs and your PhD, or even like, with working, you pick up different skills that you can apply anywhere, which is really, really helpful and important. And it's important to identify, to know what those are, so that if you have to go somewhere that's completely new and do something different that you've never done, you at least know that you have some skills that you can apply while learning how to do different things. Yeah, thank you. So Jessica, can you talk a little bit about how your work integrates with different sectors?
Sure. So there's a lot that are in the more specifically in the science field. So I work daily with MDs, right? So physicians that are treating these patients with epidemiologists to understand where, incidence and prevalence of the particular disease that we're investigating, where in the world globally do we see the greater incidence and so forth, and what is it about that population that might be different from another with respect to this particular disease. I work with pharmacologists looking at pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics to understand how the drug actually works, how long it stays in the bloodstream to understand half-life and other safety components. I work with geneticists. I work with biostatisticians. And then, also, I think the biggest thing, and Brian touched on it a little bit as well, is this idea of being open to not just working with others, but trying to understand their perspectives and, the challenges that are unique to them within their field. Because you never really know before asking a question what that answer is going to be. And it just might mean, I've seen this over and over again with people that I've mentored in my career who started off more in a clinical or R&D role within a pharma organization, and then they have a conversation with a peer that's adjacent to the project that they might be working on, and realize, wow, that's really very interesting. I think I want to try and learn more about that. And so, sometimes having that opportunity to even have a mentorship within an organization, to do ask for, could I do a 3-month transition with this department or with an area here, so I can learn a little bit about what their day-to-day is like. I've mentored a lot of direct reports and people that worked for me, that while they were happy in their job, there was something else, another spark that was that hit on something. And so it's that idea of bringing your knowledge base, but also being open to the knowledge of everyone else that you're encountering, and asking those questions to really be able to say, this is how I can move my career ahead. Or in some cases, here's how I take a step back, a couple steps back initially to eventually move it ahead. So I think those are all the components, but definitely, you come in contact with a lot of different people, with a lot of skill sets.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So I want to talk a little bit about the state of our world currently, right? And how it's affecting you all who are working in the health professions right now. And so thinking about, obviously, like, COVID-19 is huge. That's really like in our face right now, but also different things like social challenges regarding race, gender, sexuality, and climate change, and how like that affects your work, if at all, how international relations affect your work. I mean, there's so many different things that are happening in the world that do affect science and policy and all of that. And I can imagine that affects your work. And so I'm hoping that all of you could talk a little bit about what you've seen in the field, maybe what you might see coming down the pike. Yeah, Brian, would you like to take?
Maybe. So that's a tough one. So I think there are, obviously you're right, everything's interconnected. And like one of the things that I've been on a fair amount so I've talked a little bit about COVID. The kind of the biggest thing I've done with the entirety of my career has been vector-borne diseases. I mentioned Lyme disease a little bit before. And once I sort of made a little bit of a name for myself, I tend to get trotted out to go on to climate panels and things like that, because people always get the sense that, 1 degree difference means there's going to be more ticks or more mosquitoes in a particular area, which makes sense. But it's also one of those things where you get to see in many ways how interconnected everything is, both in terms of climate, both in terms of different ecosystems and so forth and so on. So I go back to, West Nile virus thing still feels like yesterday to me, but most of you guys who are actually listening in on this may not even have been born when it happened. And so it's one of those things where, we didn't find out about West Nile virus until, which is a mosquito-borne disease that made a lot of people sick, killed a fair amount of people too, and we still see it every summer. We really didn't know about it until we wound up seeing a lot of animals die and birds die. And the link between the veterinary community and the human medical community wasn't all that strong. And something like West Nile virus definitely made that link a little bit stronger, a little bit better. There's this thing we call One Health now, which is sort of a way to think about the role that human disease play with animals, and the way animal disease, the role that may play with humans. So those are things that we're trying to work on. With regards to climate, I think there's other issues that climate issues are everywhere. I did an interview with NPR a couple days ago where we were talking about climate and tick-borne disease, and those are the issues I think that are there. It's people seem to want to focus on is global warming kind of making more tick-borne diseases, and the answer to that is I'm sure it probably does, but I'm not entirely sure that it's 100%. But the problem is it's a contributing factor, and it can contribute to this. Whether or not it's going to mean that eventually Lyme disease is going to be found in the far northern reaches of Canada, I don't really know. But one of the things that people don't necessarily think about is it may lead to other diseases down the road, right? There may be a tick that's different from the one that causes Lyme disease or carries Lyme disease that may do much, much better. And, Lyme disease may go down as time goes on because there's another tick, this is actually true, that carries other diseases that seems much more likely to expand its range than the deer tick that carries Lyme does. So there's a lot of things that go on with that. I do a lot with foodborne disease too, and we see things like food droughts, ways that people reuse water, all of which is wonderful, but you better wash your produce a couple of different times before you're going to wind up because the water that's being reused for irrigation was used before for animals to wallow around in sometimes, and you wind up having a lot of foodborne produce outbreaks and things like that. There's a lots and lots and lots of issues that all of this is sort of interconnected in a lot of ways.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, definitely gave me a lot to think about, especially regarding the food piece. But yeah, absolutely. Just thinking about our ecology and environment and how, everything works together. And how one thing changes and something else changes to compensate. And so that's really fascinating. So yeah, Jessica.
Sure. So there are, I guess, two examples that I can provide in this context. So the first, as it relates to race, typically in the United States, African-American population are significantly less likely to agree to join a clinical trial. This actually dates back to Tuskegee in the 1930s, where there were experimentation done with African Americans. And there's a really big downside to the way that this hasn't escaped the memories of that community and the population. I was working in prostate cancer just 2 years ago, and African American males are at a disproportionate rate to get prostate cancer. However, in a clinical trial, we were only able to get 2% of our population to represent the African American population. There are distinct features within the population, genetically and otherwise, that would allow for medicine to be developed to target different populations differently. And so the fact that here again, we're, in 2020, almost 100 years post Tuskegee, we're still in a situation where there's that mistrust, or lack of trust within the greater medical community, and access to healthcare is another really big issue when trials are placed in areas where there isn't a large brown or Black population within a 50-mile radius, let's say, and they don't have that access to clinical trials as well, or new experimental drugs and so forth. So definitely the industry can do a lot to try and reach out and do educational programs, provide information, and to make access to healthcare, including the access to new drugs, more available to these populations. So I think that's one area, definitely from a societal perspective. The other thing as it relates to COVID, I did mention earlier, obviously, it's in the news all the time, the various COVID vaccine trials that are ongoing. And, as a matter of fact is 85% of all clinical trials in the US were actually put on hold for the last 4 to 6 months in major institutions, unless it was COVID specific. So if you were trying to do research in diabetes, the physicians who were going to be doing that research, the study team that was going to be doing that research, they were shifted off of that research to try and help with COVID, right? So, so as an industry perspective, the same thing that you're hearing, that you started hearing after there was such an emphasis to try and help those patients that were suffering from COVID, were also the patients that had chronic diseases and or suffering from other ailments, who were, in large part not seeking medical care during the height of the COVID crisis because they were afraid to go to, hospitals and clinics and so forth. So we really have to, try and understand when we're dealing with something that's stressing our community, like COVID. What do we do? How do we react? And how do we maintain a certain level so that way, that the access to medicines that are available right now continue to be, and that we can continue the research in some other vital areas that we needed to as well. So it's definitely starting to, we're seeing a shift, but there was a good 3 to 5 month period of time where that was the case.
Yeah, that's so good. And you know, I'm really glad that you touched on the public health history, right? Because that's really important in terms of understanding like why there's so many health disparities in terms of participation in trials. I think just understanding the history can help to understand the gap, right? Um, and I and it definitely does affect, like you mentioned, just drug creation in general and how it affects communities. And there's so much I think about medicine and the health professions in general that history can help to contextualize, right? Like these things didn't happen like it's not out of the blue. There are different things that happened that affect how this work is done. And I think like I'm grateful to hear that, there's an understanding of that too, because I think sometimes on a general level, we're just like, why is this the case? And it's like, well, a little bit of digging can help us to see, why things sort of shake out the way they do. So that's really good to hear. So Victor, can you talk a little bit about how our current moment is affecting your work?
Well, there's two sides, right? I'll talk about the race ethnicity side first, because I'm a Latino male. I am a rare outlier because I'm a Latino male PhD that just so happens to have an assistant professor position in research in hypertension. The outlier just keeps going. It's really hard, as a person that comes from like not only comes from an underserved community, but comes from this background. I don't see anyone around me that is like me, right? Or can kind of relate to kind of my struggle. I put it in quotes because everybody has their own struggle. But my struggle to whether it's getting grants or getting a promotion or all these things, I think my background ultimately will have something to do with it. It's very obvious now, right? So, for example, um, I'm part of a racism task force that was generated by the school, right? And part of it is because I'm the only Latino to represent the Latino community in the school, right? And it's a little, that's like a weird position to be in, but I take it, I respect it and I take great honor, and I'll do my best to be a contributor to that task force. But right now, to kind of join some of the points that Jessica made, part of that task force is really looking at systemic biases and racism that might be not so overt in medical school teaching, right? So whether it's, we're trying to teach medical students about various cases and pathologies, and we omit certain things. For example, when we talk about hypertension, African American communities are plagued by salt sensitivity and salt sensitive hypertension, and a lot of times they don't respond well to certain drugs and compounds that treat hypertension. Right? And we are trying to make it more of a point to cover these types of situations and conditions, and not just talk about hypertension as just like a blanket kind of condition, but there are nuances and ways that they affect certain communities in a certain way. Just like COVID, COVID right now is disproportionately affecting the Black and Brown community, right? And we were trying to make that something that we, can make medical students aware of, while they're being taught that they have some sort of context of what their community that they're going to be serving ultimately, what they're facing. And the virus itself has been tough. Having a research lab We are restricted with how many people we can have in the lab, how often we can have them in the lab, what experiments we can do, what we can purchase, and things like that. It's a lot of adapting, right? There's a lot of adapting and trying to do the best you can with what we have right now. And that's been really the biggest kind of shift in terms of culture and environment since the pandemic. To adapt, okay, we have different safety protocols now, and let's do the best we can. It's tough because, funding agencies, they don't really care. The deadlines haven't changed. Uh, we are here on the East Coast and on the, Midwest and other areas. They really haven't stopped doing research. They're still kind of running the show like they were beforehand. So we're at a disadvantage too. We slowed down everything while other places really never stop. So it's a little hard.
Yeah, wow. That's, I mean, yeah, especially in a lab, thinking about that sort of being a space where people can easily, catch the disease and having deadlines, right? Like you mentioned, I think it's a lot to consider and having to adapt. I mean, like obviously everybody who's on this call at Drew knows that we've had to adapt, right? And so I'm sure that the students feel that their labs look a lot different from March than they did before.
Yeah,
And
tough,
so having to adapt. Sorry, go ahead.
it's tough. One of the things that I try to make a big point about when I started my lab was to generate opportunities for students, right? Whether it's during the summer, during any break that they had. I think I came to talk at Drew, I think in January or February, right before everything happened. And I was like, hey, everybody, come to my lab. You can be there for the summer. And, you guys, I can teach you a bunch of cool things and it'll be a lot of fun. And then like 2 months later, the world changed, right? And it was really unfortunate. I wish I had that opportunity still. And eventually things will open up and it will be open up again. But it was tough.
I think that the other part that goes along with that, I mean, is in some ways this is also a place where there are opportunities that maybe there weren't before too, right? So I don't want to necessarily completely paint it that, that it's been a bad thing. I mean, public health in some ways is in people's faces like it never sort of has been before. And if that's the type of thing where that you're interested in, whether or not it's kind of the kind of traditional public health, if you will, or if it's things like a vaccine or pharmaceutical development, because there's been obviously a great big even just diagnostics, a great big sort of surge with regards to that. I mean, as students, I think the thing that's important to think about is where you can potentially get experiences when it comes to this, right? I mean, we as a state health department have hired 2,500 people to help us with contact tracing. It is it's definitely a unique job. I also, on the flip side, I've had to turn down students, like Victor, I think has, right? I mean, because this is my office. This has been my office since I don't know, since the first week of June, when things really seemed to kind of kick in and it became easier to work at home than work at the office. Um, I've had to turn down students that we would have had otherwise. It's difficult to supervise a student sort of virtually. So in that sense, but there have been all of our local health departments. When people think about places to go get an internship, for example, in a health department type field, they tend to think of state health departments. They'll think of CDC. They'll think of places like that, but they won't think of like the Morris County Department of Health or the Albany County Department of Health or places like that. And oftentimes those places are the ones that would be the most eager to snap up a student in a blink, right? I mean, the local health departments themselves are absolutely strapped for resources right now, and many of them are still open and still working. By open, I mean working in their office. And there's places that that you can potentially get into, and oftentimes these places right now are not in a spot where they're thinking, oh, I got to go do I got to go advertise for interns right now. I mean, I think if you took the initiative and wound up calling or emailing or contacting someone and basically saying, you know, hey, I'm working, I live in wherever it is that you live, Poughkeepsie, and you know, and I've got you know, my class schedule has me only, you know, in the mornings. I could volunteer for you, Dutchess County Department of Health, in the afternoon. It would not surprise me if you would, if you could kind of walk into that pretty easily. You know, I think there's a lot of opportunities like that that may be available that wouldn't have been available if it wasn't for COVID as well.
Right, absolutely. And I know that so some of my colleagues at different universities are sort of figuring out ways for students. Students are interested in medical school or really any sort of health profession school, right? Like getting that shadowing or like clinical experience, or like that person to person experience that they can't really get in person. And so being creative, like you mentioned, Brian, about reaching out to different organizations, different departments of health, and seeing, you know, what is possible for them to do, even who is it possible to just talk to, right? I think it's really important. And so being creative in this time is really, really, really important. So yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that. There are some positives that have come out of that, and just learning how we can work virtually, right? I think that's good. And how much can we get done? Which is really, it changes every day. And I think that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and during med school applications, we actually look for, you know, how people have been innovative with regards to volunteering or, you know, interning, whatever it might be during this time. You know, how they use this time, even though it's been a hectic time for a lot of people. How have they used this time wisely you know, prior to applying to medical school? It's something that we look for.
Really good to know. So I have one more question, and then we're going to open up the questions to students. So what advice would you give to students or alums who are interested in your field that you've pursued? So I think, Jessica, we can start with you.
So, I mean, if you're interested in pharmaceuticals, there are many different areas to start. There are organizations called contract research organizations. They typically you'll see some hires right out of college, starting, you know, entry level kind of positions where you're getting introduced to, you know, the clinical trial process and all the ins and outs. So that's a good area for an entry level type of position. There are also a lot of positions that are at university hospitals and other clinics to get in and doing research from the what we would call the site side, and getting experience as to, you know, what does it mean to run a trial at an institution, what it means to find participants to engage in that. And then you could always kind of transfer those initial skills over to a larger pharmaceutical company. I wouldn't say, you know, getting an advanced degree is, you know, as Victor said, I realized I wasn't going to go anywhere without this. There is, you know, and I hate to say it because I have a sophomore in high school right now, and I'm going, all right, why don't you go to a state school so we can pay for a master's degree, which sounds ridiculous, but, you know, part of it, that is some of the conversation to say, you know, depending on what your aspirations are and what you want to, where you want to be in a field, you know, getting that advanced degree many times is going to afford you more opportunities, and initially, and growth opportunities as well. So I would say, I know I'm not the only Drew alum who works in pharma. New Jersey is a hub of pharmaceuticals. So I really would say start networking, you know, find people through LinkedIn. You know, there are Drew alumni pages. There are opportunities where you can search and find people who, you know, graduated from Drew. I think using some of that to your benefit can really help. Definitely, there's always summer internships. in all of the big pharma companies. So that's another really good way to get your foot in the door and make yourself known and things of that nature. So those would be my few words of wisdom.
The thing that I would build on top of that, if it's okay to jump in, is that what you have to do, I think, in many ways, is make yourself stand out to those people who are providing internships. And so I think there's a lot of things that I think you have to sell yourself, right? You have to sell your capabilities. You have to be prepared to go and talk about that particular internship. And now it's like, some people are introverts, some people are extroverts. Oftentimes students, to be perfectly frank, I mean, students that we sometimes get through are, some of them are just bumps on a log who never do anything, only will do something when you tell them to. And then there are others who ask lots of questions, who are engaged, who are willing to ask questions, not be a pain in the ass asking questions, but basically asking questions about, why are we doing this? Or can you explain to me why this is going on, and so forth. Those are the ones that I love to engage with. And I think other people who are in a position like me, or not that I'm a mentor, but that type of thing, I think those are the type of students that stand out. They're the ones you kind of go to bat for in the end. I think you also have to get to the point where you get the internship in the first place, and that's easier now to do than others as well. If you're really interested in something, if you know right now that what you want to be when you grow up, what you want to do is you want to start learning about the field. And I think there's a lot of ways to wind up doing that. Using podcasts, I use RSS an awful lot to do things like look at journal table of contents. If there's things, I use things like ProMed, if any of you are familiar with that, is a remarkably easy and simple tool to just go through. You get emails sent to you, you get website kind of articles, kind of just titles sent to you. You can kind of you just have things that you're maybe interested in wash over you. And if you pick to read them, great. Find some podcasts that are somewhat interesting, because you never know when you're doing that interview for an internship or that interview for a first job, when something that maybe you just randomly read about or that you heard about on some podcast somewhere or something like that may give you that step up over somebody else. To me, I've always try and push that whole it's great to know a little about an awful lot, because you never know exactly when knowing that little may come in handy. And never ever burn a bridge. You never know when that's going to come back to when you might need that person down the road as well.
And if I could just add one thing, don't get discouraged if you don't get that internship, right? If you had your heart set on, and it's this field and it's this internship, anecdotally, I will say I had some temp jobs while I was in college, had nothing to do with bio. I just needed a job and I needed to work. But it was some of the things that I learned in those temp jobs that I initially took and said, oh gosh, I'm just doing this to get some money. But when you learn stuff about yourself when you're in those positions, right? So I was able to watch the mail guy, and he kept walking past me like 15 times a day. And I would go, wait, why are you doing that? If you need to go here, then just reroute yourself so that, and I mean, they didn't ask me to reroute their mail guy, right? But it's those things that you then intrinsically learn about yourself. Okay, I'm a process person. I enjoy looking at this. So it doesn't have to be squarely, where you think you ought to be in order to learn the skills that are going to help you to get to where you're going. So I would, just keep an open mind and use every opportunity, because you can use that example when you're applying for med school, even though it had absolutely nothing to do with medicine.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you. So Victor, what advice would you give to students who are, interested in where you are, but then maybe also interested in medical school, because I know you work at one of you with students.
Yeah, so if you're interested in getting into a PhD program and following that track, one of the things we look for in applicants when we do PhD admissions is, what are some some experiences that you have, right? You have lab experiences that you can bring to the table, even if it's minor. Things, you know how to pipette. These are basic things that we need you to know, and we don't really have the time or the luxury of time to really teach you, and if you come with those small, different types of skill sets, we can work with you, right? Part of our program is it gives you flexibility, and it really, let's say you come to the program, you're really interested in stem cell biology, right? You have the opportunity to do research rotations across 3 different labs. But let's say you have a research rotation in that lab with the stem cell biology, but you don't really like it, right? We give you the flexibility. Okay, you have another 2 chances to do another rotation. You might fall in love with something else. So it's a really good trait to be flexible with regards to your PhD training, because it's really just giving you a good base that you're going to take on. A lot of people, when they get their PhD, they'll either stay in academia, leave for pharma, or some other sort of industry position, whether it's medical writing, policy, or something like that. There's a lot of different options that come with getting a PhD. And sometimes you might go through your entire PhD and you realize, listen, this is not for me, right? And that's kind of tough, but it does happen, and it happens actually pretty often. But at least you leave with a degree and a skill set that you can take and apply. And employers really look at kind of your training as a whole, and kind of how productive you were. And that is a really important thing to keep note of, is your productivity throughout time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much. So now we're going to open up for questions from students. I see that Daniel wrote, so you can write in the chat. So we have one question. Let me see. So how does a student know they are a good grad school candidate? I'm currently looking at PhD programs, but I'm also a first-gen student, so I often feel unsure of which program is good for me or which I'm not qualified for.
So PhD programs come in a lot of different flavors, I would say. I would start looking at ones that are integrated like ours, right? They're basically called integrated PhD programs. And those are give you the most flexibility, meaning you might have a research interest that you have in mind, or something that you're really passionate about that you did either undergrad, or you had some sort of experience doing small amount of research that you really kind of sparked some sort of interest. And that carries over really well into integrated PhD programs. The other PhD programs, you have to come in to the program with a very specific focus. You have to come in with your own funding and things like that that you do prior. Those are becoming less abundant, and more programs are taking that integrated approach. Let's see. Yeah, if you want, I'm here, so you can send me and contact me with any information and question, and I can look at your application. And we can go through, does this program fit you? Do you really want to be doing this? What do the mentors look like? One thing that I would quickly point out, and it's something that I tell all my PhD students and people that come to our department, is that online websites are great, but they are very deceptive, right? So you will see on a school's website some research and researcher that you are so in love with whatever topic they have, right? They wrote a little blurb and you're so excited about it. But that person has no money, has no students, has no lab, but they're still on the website. So you have to do your homework. You have to talk to people, contact people in that program, and try to get as good of and as clear of an idea as to what you might be going into. Because I've had students come to me, they're like, "Oh, I really wanted to be here." I'm like, "This person has no funding, and this lab is nobody, right? They can't afford high tech or to do anything. So why would I want you to be there, and why would you want to ruin your career by going there?" Right? So We want to have these conversations. And right now, if you have questions about New York Medical College, I can tell you everything and anything you need to know about New York Medical College. And you should find people, in different programs that you're interested in that can help you in that way.
The thing I'll add a little bit to that is, again, back to my experience with schools. I mean, I think my mother freaked out when I turned down Yale to go to Albany. And again, it wasn't necessarily, because, they were two very different things. And, people would look and, 9 out of 10, 99 out of 100 would say, if you're accepted at Yale and you're accepted at UAlbany, you'll definitely wind up going to Yale. But UAlbany, again, had the thing that I was looking for, not necessarily Yale, which for me was the practical experience of working in a state health department that you couldn't necessarily get at Yale. So I think in some ways it pays to, be an educated consumer here too, when you're trying to figure out, what it is that you want to do and what school may be right for you. Just like, Victor saying that, that person on the faculty may have absolutely no ability to bring you on, which is entirely true. That happens way more often than it looks. There may be different parts or whatnot of specific programs that may be much more up your alley that instead of somebody from a more prestigious or a higher, a higher ranked place as well. Look around and look at things like that may play a role in terms of why you may be a better fit for some place as opposed to somewhere else.
Yeah, and to talk a little bit more trash about Yale for a second, even though I did my training there, you want to look at the program, right? So the PhD program at Yale, you want to talk to students, right? So if I ask a student, how long does it take on average for a student to finish their PhD, right? So at Yale, we're talking about 7 years right now to finish your PhD. While at other institutions, it might be 4 to 5 years, right? So, okay, is that time of 2 years plus or minus important to you, right? What do you want to do during that time? What is the value that they're bringing by staying there longer? Is there a value by staying there longer and doing a PhD at Yale than somewhere else? Right? You want to be very conscious about that.
Yeah.
When I wind up dealing with students too, I mean, one of the issues that we wind up going back and forth with often is whether or not, students want to come in and they want to, get like a Nobel Prize for their, their dissertation or whatnot. And sometimes you feel like you sort of have to talk them down and basically say your goal is to get your degree and get out of here, not necessarily wind up getting, doing the research that's going to, give you the Nobel Prize, while you're here in grad school. So again, it's an expectation setting exercise as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. So what other questions do you all have? Feel free to write them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. There's not that many of us in here, so I think you can just talk if you'd like to. I guess in the meantime, I think, it's so helpful to sort of give students some practical information, especially when looking for graduate programs, like talking to people who are in the program. That is so important, and seeing what is it really like? Because websites are, they're sales. they're there to sell you on like, come here, this looks really good and flashy. But I think sort of having that real information, and especially PhD program, like learning about labs, who has money, right? Like that's so important. That is so important. And it would be the worst thing to get there and be like, oh, I wanted to work with this person and they cannot hire me. And so here I am.
I have a question, Dustin, if that's okay. Well,
yeah, sure.
Other students think of a question. I've been struck by observing what seems to be a cultural challenge to science and to health expertise. I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about, on one end, the relevance of us focusing on knowledge by experts, and the importance of students thinking of this type of career trajectory to help us be a safer community, to help us be better informed, to uplift that need for us to take advantage of all the resources that we have in order for us to be in a better position, in a better place. I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about, what value do you place and how would you advise students to think of this type of career or trajectory as they consider their paths?
I'm not entirely sure completely how to answer that. I mean, but I guess I think that, I think everyone has something that drives them to some extent is the way that I look at this. For me, it took me a little time to figure out what it was, but eventually I figured out that I needed to feel like I was making a difference in the world to some extent, right? So, so I searched out jobs that would potentially, and careers that would help me wind up doing that. For me, that typically means the public sector, right? I mean, it's the way that I've been in government pretty much all the time. And it is, I've worked at local health departments, I've worked at state health departments, I've worked with CDC and so forth as well. So it is, that's my lane, that's my alley. And I think I think in some cases it takes a little bit of time for you to sort of find, what that lane or what that alley is. Is there a way to help figure that out? I think in some ways it just comes with experience and sort of trying to figure that out. I mean, I think you do have to get a sense of sort of, what drives you. What do you feel like do you want to be, feel like you make a difference in the world? Do you want to be, is that more important to you, or is it more important to, have a comfortable family life or so? And the two, I don't want to make it sound like those are diametrically opposed to one another, but I think you need to figure out what's important and what's not as you try and figure out where you're going to kind of, which direction you're going to wind up looking.
Yeah, I think fit is extremely important. Like where you fit, how you feel you fit into a certain situation. If you go into the lab and you don't like the people that you're working with, and you're just not comfortable, or you don't like the project, or you don't like the mentor, and you just don't feel like it fits you, and you're not comfortable there, you have every right and get out of there. Find something else that you fits and you kind of are excited about and passionate about, right?
For God's sakes, don't torture yourself for 6 years.
Yeah.
Just to get done.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's really important. This concept of fit is huge. If I didn't care about what I'm working on right now, there's no way I would want to be doing it for the rest of my life. It's just kind of basically what I signed up for just now. So yeah, that's really important.
Yeah, I would just add to that. So my husband, who is also a class of 99 alum, was going to med school. He took his MCATs, he got into med school. He called me frantic during the summer before, we have to meet. Can you drive? We need to meet. And I'm like, oh, okay, sure. He goes, I want to be a teacher. And I went, oh, no, I'm just kidding. So I said, I saw that coming a mile away, but he was set on that from the very beginning. And he, and he got into med school and, and that was supposed to be his path. Fast forward 20 years later, he is an AP biology teacher at a high school. He loves it. It's his absolute favorite thing in the world. It also afforded him the ability. He's also a soccer coach. And, he's still very much keeping abreast of new things that are coming in, the biology field and so forth, and keeps very relevant for his students. But that was his aha moment, and it happened before he, quote unquote, would have wasted those 4 to 6 years, in med school and internships and so forth. But, everyone at some point in their life, whether it's when you're 20, 22, 26, 30, you'll have that aha moment. But I think you have to be true to yourself. Don't let outside influences, of family expectations or societal expectations or other things of that nature force you into, pursuing a path that you believe is the right path for you. And, if you do start down a path and you realize this isn't it, that's not the end of it, right? You can always change. Just like what was the figure, 11.9 job transitions is what's expected. So, I mean, it's not a bad thing, right? It's inherently where we are as a society. It means that you're learning and you're growing and you're adapting. So.
Yeah, my family was really disappointed when I decided not to go to med school, but they were really excited about when I discovered something that was really unique. And now that's all they ask me about. How's the receptor going? How's this going? And I'm like, oh, you really enjoy what I'm doing. And that makes me happy,
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a great note to end on.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's 8:30, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I think that's a really good note to end on, just to say, like, figure out why you're doing what you want to do, right? And make sure that that is what drives you through. And I think we all know, right? I think deep down inside, it's just a matter of fact of, like, sort of getting to that point and being honest, right? And having mentors and advising, exploring, networking can help us to learn more about ourselves and to really make choices that align with who we are, and finding a career that aligns with that too. So thank you all so much. I think this has been great. I'm pretty sure that students who watch this on the replay will find the information that you all shared really valuable, and will get them to consider where they want to be in the health professions, or even if they're not sure where they want to be, that this is a field that they can consider. And so I'm grateful that you all agreed to be here. So thank you so much. Yeah, if you could drop your emails in the chat, that would be great. So students who might want to reach out to you can. And then we'll have them on the website as well with the recording. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dunstanet. Thank you for all your work on this.
No problem. Glad to do it. All right. Have a great evening, everybody.
You too.
Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.